and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today we are doing Argentina travel vlog part 2. We are going to get into that. So for this part of the travel vlog, I am staying in San Telmo, which is a very touristy area, and we're spending more time kind of in like the southern touristy part of Buenos Aires. So we're going to be going to La Boca. We're going to be going around and seeing some of like the more political buildings. We are going to go back to the Recoleta Cemetery because I'm obsessed. But other than that, we're mainly staying a little bit further south than we did on our last leg. Spoiler alert, I would highly recommend San Telmo and staying in San Telmo over Palermo if you enjoy the types of things I enjoy. But with that, let's go ahead and hop into the footage. After dropping our bags in our hotel, we went for somewhere to eat. We got croissant and coffee, and this is the restaurant we ate at. This cafe is in La Galleria del Viejo Hotel, which was built in 1860 as a hotel for basically when immigrants arrived, and then during the yellow fever epidemic it became a hospital before then reverting again to a hotel, and now it is an art gallery. This place is really cool. It was definitely fun to look around, and it was okay to eat. I will say that restaurant was not the best restaurant we ate at. I don't know how highly I'd recommend it, but the environment was really nice and peaceful, so take that for what you will. From here, we got into our hotel rooms. Here, I'm giving you just a little tour. The bathroom in here is really nice. I have to say, this is by far my favorite hotel we stayed at as far as location, service, rooms, everything. I mean, the room is technically smaller, but it was really, really beautifully designed, even though it has a rain shower, which isn't my favorite. You know, ignore how iffy I look. We've just been traveling. But yeah, not a very big room. However, the location was so good. It's totally fine. It did have a courtyard. It had a nice restaurant, so this got an A+ for me. And the people working here were so good at their jobs that I would highly recommend this hotel. It is the next morning. We're getting ready for our day. This is some of the best French toast I've ever eaten, as well as really good juice. This cafe was probably my favorite cafe we ate at, and it was beautiful, so that's always a plus. Today was the day I wanted to return to Recoleta Cemetery, so we did. So we're gonna walk around, look at some tombs. I'm gonna talk about some of the more famous tombs here that we were able to make stops at this round, and then I will also be talking about some unfortunate history in Buenos Aires that I think is important to be aware of because it was something I didn't know about until I came here. So this is our first famous tomb, which it's really interesting because I don't feel like this looks like anything that crazy. Like, there's a lot cooler tombs here, but this is a grave of Eva Perón, who was a very controversial figure in Argentinian history. Up here, this statue in this tomb is pretty famous. This is the statue of Liliana Crociade de Sazak. So she was 26 years old when she died in an avalanche in Austria on her honeymoon, and the myth is her dog died the same day as her, which is why you see her dog next to her, and she's wearing her wedding dress, and it's a really beautiful statue and very kind of spooky, but she's one of the famous graves here. I assume there has to be some luck around the dog's nose since it's rubbed to be shiny gold, so I assume people are touching it. Also, since she died in the 70s, she's wearing a 70s dress, which I thought was really interesting. We'll walk through some other tombs. I could actually not find this tomb of another famous person. The tomb that I could not find was that of Rufina Cambaceres. And basically, they thought she died, and when they came the next day after putting her in the coffin, her coffin was all scratched up, and she had unfortunately died. It is another one of the famous residents of this graveyard. Also in the cemetery, there's of course your usual politicians and like big mucky mucks, but I don't usually find those tales particularly interesting. They're not in the cemetery, but I wanted to mention these. These are tiles laid by the Barrios y Memoran y Justica, which is a grassroots group that lays tiles like these that are highly individualized for people who were disappeared during the military dictatorship. I just think this is a really important time of history to talk about, and our guide, Elisa, from the last video, she actually was a teenager during this period, but basically during this time frame, between 1976 and 1983. It is estimated that 30,000 people in Argentina were kidnapped by the military government and killed, as well as tortured and all these other terrible things. I think it's really important to talk about this part of their history, both because it's so recent and you will see these memorials across the city. I really appreciate grassroots art movements like this because I think they're really impactful. Like, thinking about these tiles make me want to cry because they're set at the last place these people were seen, and they're set by people who like knew them, and they actually get to have individualized memorials, which is so powerful when you're talking about a mass group of people who were killed during a dictatorship. Giving them back their singular identities is so important. The other reason I think it's worth talking about is the United States was pretty key in this military dictatorship getting installed. So like this is a huge point in history, unfortunately, where Argentina and the US are tied. And I think as someone from the US visiting Argentina, it's really important to acknowledge this time in history. And I felt like this time walking around the cemetery was a good time to talk about this. We saw these tiles all over the city, but I can't imagine losing those people and never getting closure, because I think it's so important to acknowledge the humanity of the people who disappeared. I think it's particularly important to acknowledge these disappearances right now, as the next elected president is very far to the right and is feeling a lot of fears among the people of Argentina about a loss of rights, or reminding them of the far-right military dictatorship that people disappeared under. Also, his VP has on multiple occasions denied the idea that as many people were killed by the government as actually happened. So essentially she is denying the crimes of the government against its own people. I don't know, I'm just really heartbroken for Argentina right now, specifically for queer people there and indigenous people there, because this does not bode well for them. It also does not bode well for their financial situation, as well as their healthcare and their education. I do understand like how he got elected with the way inflation was going, and history does tend to repeat itself, and like I don't think we're looking to a dissimilar situation in the US where he was up against a guy who had been there and kept the status quo and things were really bad, and so people didn't turn up to vote for the less bad option, which yeah, again, just feels very similar to where we are in the US. But not to stay too down for too long, I do want to transition us out of this, but I just think it's really important to be aware what's going on politically and what's gone on in the past in the country you're visiting, as well as your country's relationship to those things that happen. And like I cried this weekend when I found out he won the election, because all the people I met there and talked to there were so frightened about it, and I know they're like feeling really downtrodden right now. From Recoleta Cemetery, we are now going to walk all the way back to San Telmo, where our hotel is located, and we're intentionally making some architecture and big square stops. This first one is by the Teatro Colón. We tried to tour inside this, but all the English tours for the rest of our time here were booked up. But this is also the Parque La Valle, and it features just a lot of really cool architecture around it, and is overall just a really beautiful plaza. Another one to note is that really beautiful building next to the theater with the columns is a school, and I just always find that fascinating. And then I love this building here, which is like this old tower sticking out of what looks like a very modern building. It looks like they built this building and preserved the craftsmanship of this building, and I just thought that was absolutely wild. We then continued to make sure we saw the obelisk, which is one of the big things in the city. I would compare the vibes to this as very similar to Times Square, with all the big billboards and kind of the crowds, and it like being the center of, I would say, like the touristy area of the city. It was interesting to see. We're glad we saw it, but we didn't spend much time here. One of the reasons I recommend walking through a city is you get the opportunity to go down streets like this. Sorry for such shaky, wild footage. This was just a very chaotic part of town, but what this was is this is where like a ton of like gold and jewelry shops were. It just was very urban feeling and was an interesting part of town I don't think we would have run into had we not decided to walk all the way from Recoleta down to San Telmo. And this really cool building is Palacio Barrodo, and it was next to these beautiful clock towers, and we're headed into a big square from here. So here we are in the Plaza del Congreso. This is equivalent to like going and seeing where Congress is held in the US, right? So this is that area. It of course has a lot of really beautiful buildings that, again, I guess remind me of going to see the Congress buildings in DC in the United States. However, it does have a big plaza that has a lot of places to sit, which the US does not necessarily have that. And the other thing I wanted to note is there's these really beautiful lights. What you see here, those two things that kind of look like turds, those are bird nests. We saw this all around Buenos Aires, but this is the clearest shot. It was able to get of them for you. Now we're gonna go walk over to where the Congress building is. I think because we were just getting to spring, it hadn't been on yet, but this is like a big fountain meant to represent Congress. My bet is the gating is all around it, but it also just might be because there's more political unrest right now with the inflation and the elections. So I don't know if those gates are always up. Somebody else who lives here would have to tell me that. It was kind of unfortunate because I would have loved to see some of those statues in more detail. I will say this grass was very muddy. This was a mistake. It was worth it, I guess. And now we'll just get close to the Congress building. Around here, there were a couple different protests happening as well as gatherings. From what I could tell, some of the protests were around Indigenous people and a land back movement. My Spanish again is pretty poor. And then there was some graffiti against. So as always in any country, when you get around the big political houses, it's fascinating to see the different movements that are there because that will tell you some of what's going on politically in the country. Our goal to reach San Telmo by foot was not successful with both of our knee situations. So we did end up Ubering back, and I just want to show you some sights of the city. You can see again a lot of these pink trees coming to life. When I one day come back to Buenos Aires, my plan will be to come back in the middle of November when all these trees are in full bloom and it is full on spring, because just from seeing the beginning of spring, I can tell it's stunning here. I also wanted to show you just how giant the roads here are. I feel like we talk about how big roads are in the US, but when we were a pedestrian, we were regularly crossing like 8-lane one-way roads, which is pretty wild. This is not a good documentation of that, but it's what I have, so. And then we got tacos at a taco place, and these were excellent, and the taco place was super cute. We did very few proper nights out. What we are doing tonight is we are going to the Madero Tango show. I did some research and it seemed like the food here was better than most, and I would agree with that, although the food was still not great. But we were mainly there for the tango show, so that's totally okay. I'm not going to play anything that's recorded, but all of this is live performance. But I just wanted you to see some of the show. The dancers were incredibly impressive, and I really actually wish we maybe saw more tango shows when we are here, or like went to more areas with good tango. This morning we had a different cafe where there was carrot cake. Carrot cake was kind of a huge thing here that I just didn't expect. And here is a cool art piece that we found that I just wanted to show you. And I also liked the wrought iron of the balconies above it. And for this morning, we are headed to La Boca neighborhood, specifically to the Caminito, which is a open air museum of all these colorful houses. We decided to do this in the morning for a couple of reasons. One being it would hopefully be less crowded. This is an area that is known for having more pickpockets, and so we were hoping earlier in the day there would be less of that. This was definitely like the most touristy area we were in, and was the area I felt like we were hassled the most as tourists, if that makes sense. But it is well worth seeing. Do not skip this on your tour. It is a bunch of colorful houses. The reason they say the houses are painted different colors is back when this was not a street museum, it was a poorer area of town, and so basically people would paint their houses with what they had, so they would end up with these different patches of different colors. So that is why it is so colorful. The main bummer of if you go in the morning is you miss out on all the tango dancers that I guess are usually on the street, which we didn't get to see, which was a bit of a bummer. But this was a super cool area. I loved all the color. There was like grilled meat in the air. It was just definitely a really cool area, and I love color, so I really enjoyed this. Also in this area is La Bombonera, which is a big stadium that hosts the Boca Juniors team, which is a big team in Argentina. And here, real quick, I'm just showing you the sky of what it looks like when they open all those meat grills. La Boca is called La Boca because it's by the mouth of a river, and I just enjoyed the very colorful like boat and dock here, as well as these super colorful cobblestones with the colorful houses. I just loved this area. I thought it was super fun. After this, we again took an Uber. We are headed to a different part of town. We wanted to go see the Pink House. We have made it to the Pink House. The Pink House, unlike the White House in America, is just the presidential office. The president does not actually physically live here. The Pink House is actually painted pink. This is like not a pink stone or anything like that. The kind of like legend goes was it was painted pink to like diffuse political tensions by mixing red and white colors of the two opposing political parties, which is just interesting. There's alternative explanations that say it was that the original paint contained cow's blood to prevent damage from humidity. So who knows what's actually true? Either way, it is an interesting color. And around the plaza is, of course, lots of very impressive architecture, as always. This is interesting because we have the French architecture here like normal, but there is also a building that features mission style, which actually is typically, I think of mission style architecture in general a little more when it comes to South America. That might just be because I'm not educated, but it was interesting that this is the only mission style building we saw in the whole city. I'm sure, of course, there are more mission style buildings. It just wasn't where we are. We then ate in this very fancy restaurant that had a really good salad and was built in 1810. And the interior was lovely. It's always fun to get to eat in such historic buildings. From here, we began a wander. This is a corner by a church, but eventually our goal is to wander over to, there's like a river peninsula area that has a lot more modern skyscraper type buildings. So this is the riverside. As you can see on the right, there's a lot of really, really modern, sleek looking skyscrapers. And that is where like kind of the weird peninsula is. This is like a channel between the main city and this. We walked through some of the city part here. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't excited by this because this feels like the city I live in. But of course it is important to highlight that places like these have like more modern architecture. And here we are walking by on the left what is like an ecological reserve. We didn't end up walking into the reserve because we were pretty walked out by the time we got to the reserve. But as you can see, it's really, really beautiful. And even though we were above the reserve, there were still lots of places to sit and enjoy looking at the birds. It's just not as close to water level. I mean, I just even enjoy those two white cranes flying around. Like most of the city, of course, there were giant trees here too. I just will say I really enjoyed how big the trees are here. It feels like trees in the cities I live in never get to be this big. I almost regretted our fancy lunch because there were so many cool food trucks and little food stops on our walk that I would have loved to eat at, but we were pretty full at this point. No luck for us eating here, but I definitely think this area would be a great area to eat in for some street food while you're here in Buenos Aires. Here you can tell we're in a really, really, really upscale part of town. Oh my goodness, look at these buildings and this fancy fountain. This was just really something, and I'm really glad we went into this part of the city, even though it wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. And it's kind of fun to contrast this like rich people sculpture art to the like street art of the rest of the city. And now to the part of the day I was so excited for, not that everything else wasn't cool. We had passed this pottery gallery when it was closed at a different point in time, and I absolutely just wanted to visit it. Everything here was so beautiful. All the artists are really talented. I will link them down below. But I was so happy we finally got to step in and see this gallery, and I bought quite a few pieces here. I loved the mix of like function and art. And as you guys know, I love ceramics, so this was absolutely so exciting for me. I had to refrain from not buying everything because also everything was really affordably priced. I also wanted to show a little bit of that outside of the shop because they had artwork. I loved the little tile on the street, and then they had a beautiful painted sign. I should have filmed more in this shop because it was a crazy vintage shop. I highly recommend this shop. The owner, once she understood like what I like, she was so warm, and she actually took us into this room. I had no idea this room existed from looking at the shop. I bought quite a few things here, but there were also so many beautiful and unique pieces. Vintage shopping in other countries is always really fun because you see pieces that aren't like anything you've seen in the States, and some of these like silk pieced together wedding gowns were some of that. So it was all incredible, and the owner of the shop was so kind to show us her collection. Even though she spoke a little bit English and I spoke a little bit of Spanish, we were able to get to this room and kind of have, through Google translating and bad Spanish, have a really great conversation about vintage fashion and why we loved it. So I continue to love the way vintage clothing seems to be able to bring me together with people from other culture. I think it's really important. Both this and the pottery are ways that I've connected across the world. So if you have like a hobby that is important to you, it's really fun to get into the spaces that hobby exists when you travel abroad. Next up, we are headed to a art museum. It was really, really important to me that with the art museums we saw particularly Argentine art, because so often a lot of these places have all these galleries full of European art, but you can find museums that are purely local art, and this museum is purely art from Argentina, and it was the modern artist from Argentina. Sorry the footage is so bad, but this was such a cool museum. 10 out of 10. You absolutely have to go to this one. It was so cool to see just a ton of different work, and what's really cool is I feel like in Argentina, more than maybe some other places I've been, they clearly really value textile art as art, which is not always true. So there's also a lot of modern textile art in this museum. Also their use of color and everything. It is not surprising that I absolutely loved it here. Lots of really mixed media things. I know modern art is not everyone's cup of tea. I like modern art. I understand the effort it takes to go into art. A lot of people are like, oh, well, I could just burn something and do that. And no, you can't. It actually takes trial and error to get the visual look you want. So definitely, again, highly recommend this museum. And I promise every country you go to, you can find the worldwide art museums, but you can find local based art museums that only focus on local artists. So do that work, do that extra step of research. You won't regret it. Some of the art in this museum is the most exciting art I've seen in a really long time. We only got to see 1.5 levels of this museum because we came right at closing time, so they were kind of moving people out of galleries, but this was the last one I saw. There was a lot of textile art in here, and this is all art by indigenous Argentine artists, so that's really cool. And again, I promise you can find these museums wherever you go. You just have to put in the extra effort to find these places instead of your typical art museum. This is the last piece of art I'm going to talk about in this. I will hopefully have the artist's name. This is the first art exhibit in a really long time that really, really, really moved me. Like, I had to stop myself from just crying in this art exhibition. There was just something about the way they used all these forms that was just devastating. I don't know how to explain it, but it just, like, for me as somebody who struggles with like depression and anxiety and other things, this big sculptural piece with all the drawings that led up to it just was so moving to me. And yeah, I had to kind of like keep it together because I know it's okay to cry in a museum from the art you see, but I just have a hard time crying like that in public. But I was just so moved by this piece. This piece just really had something to it that moved me, and I think that's what really good art does. And for dinner, we had kind of like tapas style with some empanadas and other foods. This was the restaurant in our hotel, and I would highly recommend this restaurant even if you're not staying in the hotel. Again, the service was excellent, the food was excellent, and we really enjoyed it. And the aesthetic, of course, was very enjoyable. For breakfast, we are again back at that cafe. I got the same exact thing, and it was delicious again. Again, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 20. 10 out of 30. Just kidding, that's the wrong way. 30 out of 10, duh. So we actually leave tonight, so our goal is to stay close to where our hotel is. So we're just going through this really fun park. This park has a lot of really cool Greek and Roman architecture vibes. I really need to go back and learn the difference between Greek and Roman architecture, but they're very similar usually. But yeah, we just enjoyed this. It looks like there was like some sort of like ancestry altar or something in there. I didn't go and bother it because that's not my business. Even though it was a Friday morning, we were here on a extended weekend, so we got to see a lot of doggos. This park is very full of dogs, like all parks. I don't think I've mentioned this in any of my other videos, but there are more dogs than children in Buenos Aires, and they are a heavy dog culture. I asked about the cat culture, and my tour guide said that cats were a little bit less of a thing here than dogs. Like, dogs were definitely like reigned supreme here, which I take a little bit of issue with, but I do love a dog, so you know. After sitting a while and watching the dogs, we went and looked at the views. This park is kind of known for having views of the city. I don't know that I would say these views are like the most exciting part of the park. I definitely just preferred the general vibe and like liveliness of the park. I much preferred how much of a community this felt like, and having all the fun dogs and seeing all the people like doing. There was like a Tai Chi group here. Like, this was clearly a very communal space, and I enjoyed that aspect and the beauty of this park more than the views. And on the variety of architecture here. Look at this Russian church. The pieces were actually shipped from Russia, from St. Petersburg, which is really cool. One day I would really like to go see this like type of architecture. It's one of my favorite types of architecture because of the color and the texture. In more things that I find interesting here, look at these trees' root system, like how above the ground and thick they are. There were people at one point chilling on these roots, like they were a chair, which I thought was cool. Obviously they had left at this point, but yeah, this tree was really something. And from here we wanted to just enjoy one last walk through the city, stopping by some of our favorite murals and buildings. And yeah, this just was, I love Buenos Aires. I could probably stay here a really long time and not get bored. This is the first city I've been in since Rome that I really feel like I could live here, which is not usually how I feel post-vacation. Our last meal was at Alice's Tea, which is really cool. You should check them out. They're clearly family run, and like there was a guy and his kid, and it was great. I love supporting businesses like this, and on top of it the food was delicious and it was so cute. Most cafes offer these like 2-people deals where you get like 5 different types of pastries and a coffee and a juice. So that's what we did here. We wanted to do that the whole time we had been here, but this was our first opportunity that we really took. And we still had a couple of hours before we left for the airport. So one of the places I wanted to wander in, because I felt like we had such a peaceful morning. This is a really cool marketplace that I just couldn't take sensory-wise any of the other times, but I finally felt able to be in here. So we went in here and we looked around. There's a lot of vintage, like antique-y type of places here, as well as like things like cards. It's kind of like, it's almost flea market-y in feeling, or like if you crossed a flea market and a vintage mall. If I had any cash left at this point, I would have been in trouble, but I had no cash left, and that was a good thing. Or not no cash, it's just I had little cash compared to where we were at. Some of these stalls stuff was in US dollars too, so it was actually like not expensive, but like more expensive than places that are in the peso. But it was still so fun to look around. It's always great to see how people display different things. So we just kind of walked around, and then we both got overstimulated and had to leave. And then this was like a place that I saw a ton of people going in and we were curious about, and it was one of these fun umbrella like places where they have all the colorful umbrellas, and also the plants in there were gorgeous. This was a gorgeous little thing. Wish we knew about it earlier, because we could have come here in the morning when it was empty. It's definitely worth looking if you're in the area. I wouldn't like go out of your way for this place, but it was fun and it was cool. But we quickly got overstimulated, and so we left for this area to go back to the main square. But first, look at this antiques display. This is like a bunch of colorful antiques, which is my jam. So like I mentioned, it was a holiday weekend, so I was reading about the holidays here, and it sounds like they have some things that are almost like a floating holiday, for lack of a better term. There's just a certain number of weekends in the year they require to be 3-day weekends, or I think maybe even 4-day. Really cool, and it explains why this area was so busy. There was a whole festival going on. This was like an exciting way because we basically just had like a half hour that we could just sit here and watch the dancers. There were also some live rock musicians here, which was really fun, and we just thoroughly enjoyed sitting here and enjoying the festival atmosphere, as well as like the architecture feeling more like Europe. The work culture here also definitely felt more like Europe than it does in like the United States, who apparently we like to work ourselves to death. First of all, we had a lot of money left, so we were able to tip all the performers at this event very well, so we were really excited about having that cash on us still. These tango dancers were super fun to watch. I do not know tango well enough to know like what excellent tango is, but I thoroughly enjoyed these. I am one for more glittery costumes, but that's a me problem. And this was incredible. It was very fun to watch. And I'm really glad we got this, because when we were in La Boca, we were there too early for tango dancers. So I'm really happy we got to see tango dancers. It was really enjoyable. Sorry, this is all voiceover and I'm not having the actual music in. It's that they're playing music that is copyrighted. So I just don't want to mess with the YouTube gods there. And now we're headed on the highway on the way to the airport. We were both ready to go home, but quite sad to leave Buenos Aires. I hope to be back here again sometime soon. I don't let myself repeat a place for 5 years, but right now I like doing the voiceover of this video just makes me so badly want to be back there, because we had such a good time. And hard to say, it's like one of my favorite places I travel, but I say that about everywhere I travel. I definitely loved it. So we're gonna go into wrap up. My camera's a bit askew, but we're gonna deal. You have seen the footage. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed going back through my footage and doing voiceover. It actually made me miss being in Buenos Aires. I would really like to go back, so that tells you what I felt about this trip. But we're gonna go over a couple things here that I like noted to cover. First thing actually is safety. So a lot of people were very concerned about me traveling to South America. Uruguay and Argentina are two of the safest places to travel in South America. I heard there would be a lot of pickpocketing and thievery in Buenos Aires, so I came prepared. I will say, while I did see it, there were a couple points where we saw when people were getting on buses, bag snatchers come by and take their bags, and then they would run, and then their moped buddy would go and link up with them. Not that that isn't a big deal, however, I've seen this happen in Rome and in Paris. Like, I would say I felt just as safe in Buenos Aires as I did in Rome, actually arguably more so. Granted, I'm a little bit more of a well-traveled person now than I was in my early 20s in Rome. I didn't really feel like there were huge problems. Part of me wants to say it might be a little bit of like tourism racism because I got the same warnings about Bangkok and other places, and definitely the most dangerous place I feel like I've ever traveled is Paris. Take that with a grain of salt. I'm not saying these things don't happen, however, I'm just saying that I felt very safe. However, I will also say me and the friend I'm with, we live in a city. We're city people. We're used to having to be aware. Not to say like you can be dumb, right? The rules there are the rules in any city. Like, don't go places that it looks like there aren't people. Know your neighborhoods and know where you can be. Like, look like you're walking with purpose. Don't look like you're dilly-dallying and being clueless. And that's just kind of like a general rule in a city. I don't know if like all those travel warnings are for people who don't live in cities, because I will say like Buenos Aires and Montevideo felt like any city that I've ever been to where you just have to be aware and like know where you are, right? There's definitely cities I've been in that you can be real, like in Seoul you can definitely be hella clueless, but that's not true for a majority of cities in the world. So I just will say I did not feel any safety risks. I'm also going to caveat this with I was traveling with a white man. I like don't know if I would have gotten harassed more on the streets had I not been with him. I don't feel like I saw harassment of women much there, but I'm sure it again exists. And I definitely am speaking with the privilege of someone who was traveling with a man, right? So like all that, I guess, with a grain of salt. However, I don't think Buenos Aires in the tourist areas are any more dangerous than a lot of other cities. Of course, if you go into the non-touristy areas, I think it's a really different story. Kind of along those lines, talking about Uber. So we used Uber for most of the trip, and most of the time it was pretty okay. I will say, like, compared to American Uber, where you can pretty much get anyone to pick you up in certain spots. So Uber is considered competitive with taxi cabs, so like we couldn't get an Uber at any of the ferry terminals. We had to walk quite a bit, and it was harder to get an Uber after dark than it was to get one during the day. I thought Ubers were really cheap. Most of our Ubers were less than $4, so I thought Uber was perfectly viable. I'm sure public transit would be like 20 cents if that's what you wanted to do. However, I would also say a lot of like the purse snatchings we saw and stuff like that happen on public transit, and that's usually why I try to avoid public transit in certain countries when there's such a cheap option like Ubering. And also, like, kind of on the Uber note, we did, if you're doing the ferries or doing anything like that, just do the arranged like people picking you up thing, so you don't have to figure out the taxi deal. We definitely got into a scam taxi, which we knew it when we did it. We got into a scam taxi after getting back from Montevideo, and we fully knew we were going into scam taxi when we did it. It basically meant that instead of paying the $1 we would have paid for the taxi, we paid $4, and so we like went into that knowing that, and that was fine with us. Weather. As far as going there in October, you're kind of in between. You're in between essentially their winter and spring, so it was a little bit more chilly than I expected. I definitely am glad I picked up the one coat when I was there because I was a little bit cold. I definitely did not bring enough weather appropriate things. However, as the like 2 weeks went on, it definitely got warmer. So when I went to Thailand and Korea earlier this year, I had really detailed planned out that trip. I kind of did the opposite with this trip, partially because I was burned out on trip planning because of all the other travel I had done this year. So I didn't really plan anything, and the week before I was researching stuff. As a result, I do feel like we missed out on some tours because there's not that many English speakers who travel there. There's actually not a ton of tours if you're English speaking, and it does seem like they sell out. There are a lot of places that I would have loved to see the inside and do those tours, and we would have needed to plan more in advance. And then there was also an LGBTQ tour I wanted to go on and an Afro-Latina tour I wanted to go on that ended up selling out, so we couldn't go on them. In the future, I will try to only be traveling when I have the bandwidth to plan it just a little bit better. It was fun to do the loosey-goosey travel thing. We still saw a ton. It's not like I regret it or anything. It's just it was good to try a different style of traveling, to learn that perhaps I want things to be a little bit more structured for me. That was just something that was good to learn and that I hadn't really learned in the past. Overall thoughts on Buenos Aires, I feel like I've said a bunch of times already, I want to go back so bad. I'm not going to go back for a while, and when I go back, I want to go in all the buildings I want to go in, and I also want to go back hopefully when it's a little bit less unstable with the inflation and things like that, just because I think we would have a happier population when we're there, and traveling places during kind of that unrest inflation situation is just, if you're human, it's hard. I don't want to watch people suffer, right? The people I met there I liked so much that like thinking about what they're going through just sucks, right? I wanna go back, and I can probably safely say at some point I will go back, because this was like kind of a test of going to South America. I just wanted to try it out, see how I felt, build some confidence. When I do go back, I am going to know more Spanish. I will say that I'm not allowing myself to go back until I'm at least like conversationally fluent. I feel like I missed out on so much being an English speaker, and I want to spend more time in some of the different towns or Patagonia or places like that, and I think I really need to have Spanish to do that. I will say I highly recommend traveling to Buenos Aires. It can be a good, I think, first international trip if you're fluent in Spanish already, which a lot of people here are. They do speak a different dialect there, but I think you could probably get by well enough. At bare minimum, they'll be able to understand you, right? As far as like your first time ever traveling internationally, if you don't speak Spanish, I would probably not recommend it, just because it's not super catered to English speaking tourists compared to other places. Even though I think it's well worth traveling, I think like for your first time on a really like abroad trip, if you're American, just try something. Like, I actually do think Seoul would be a good option. I guess England's a good option, but I think you should really try places that don't speak the same language as you. I always recommend Italy, but I know people feel kind of actually mixed about that. And I spent my first time there, I spent 6 weeks there, so I don't feel like I'm a good judge. Just try somewhere maybe a little bit more baseline American touristy before doing Buenos Aires if you do not speak Spanish. I felt fine there, but I'm a pretty experienced traveler at this point. So yeah, that's just kind of my final thoughts. Hopefully I'll be back there in a few years. But with that, I'm gonna wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative, and I will see you actually later this week with a haul of what I brought back from Buenos Aires and Montevideo. So I will see you then. Bye!